The night shift in the emergency room was chaos. Multiple trauma patients, exhausted doctors, and one quiet security guard watching it all. But when Dr. Martinez collapsed from exhaustion and patients needed immediate help, the security guard stepped forward with medical skills that revealed he wasn't just watching. He was a Purple Heart combat medic who had saved lives in Afghanistan's deadliest battles. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Frank Rodriguez walked his usual rounds through St. Mary's Hospital. It was 2:47 a.m., and the emergency department was busier than he'd seen it in months. 3 car accidents, 2 overdoses, and a heart attack had turned the normally quiet night shift into controlled chaos. Frank had been working hospital security for 8 years now. At 52, with graying hair kept military short and a slight limp from an old injury that flared up during long shifts, he blended into the background of the medical world around him. Most people saw the uniform, navy blue with security embroidered on the chest, not the man wearing it. When Frank had first applied for this job 8 years ago, he'd been fresh out of the VA hospital, struggling with phantom pain from shrapnel still lodged in his left leg. The hospital administrator had looked at his resume, security experience, military background, clean record, and hired him on the spot. What she didn't know was that Frank had applied for 12 different jobs in 6 months and been turned down every time. Too old for some positions, overqualified for others, underqualified for the medical roles he actually wanted. St. Mary's had become more than just a job. It had become his way of continuing to serve, even if nobody knew how. He knew every inch of this hospital, every door code, every emergency protocol, every hiding spot where exhausted residents caught 15-minute naps between traumas. Frank had become part of the furniture, a familiar face that patients and staff acknowledged with polite nods but rarely truly saw. Tonight was different, though. Tonight the hospital was critically understaffed and overwhelmed, pushing everyone to their limits. The chaos had started building around 9 p.m. Frank had watched it unfold from his position near the main entrance, where he monitored who came and went while keeping an eye on the emergency department's growing activity. In his 8 years here, he'd developed an almost sixth sense for when a normal shift was about to become something much worse. The first accident had come in around 11 p.m., a family of 4 whose sedan had been T-boned by a drunk driver. Frank had watched through the emergency department's windows as the ambulances arrived, their flashing lights painting the walls in alternating red and blue. The parents were critical, the children traumatized, but stable, clinging to each other in the family waiting room with that look Frank recognized from children he'd treated in Afghan villages after attacks. By midnight, the situation escalated. A motorcycle versus semi-truck collision brought in a 23-year-old rider whose bike had gone under the trailer. Frank had seen enough combat casualties to recognize the look in Dr. Martinez's eyes when the paramedics wheeled him in, the grim determination mixed with the knowledge that they were fighting against impossible odds. Then came the overdoses. A 17-year-old who'd taken fentanyl at a house party, and a construction worker who'd turned to opioids after losing his job. Frank had gently guided the panicked teenagers to a quiet corner while social services figured out next steps and later brought coffee to the construction worker's wife and daughter, both trying not to cry in the waiting room. Finally, a heart attack, a 58-year-old nurse from another hospital visiting her mother. Frank had helped wheel her mother down from the 5th floor so she could be by her daughter's side. Dr. Martinez had been moving between all these cases for 14 straight hours, and Frank could see the signs he'd learned to recognize in Afghanistan, the way medics looked just before they hit their breaking point. Frank positioned himself at his usual observation point near the nurse's station, where he could monitor the entire emergency department. He'd learned to read people during his 3 tours in Afghanistan as a 68W combat medic with the 10th Mountain Division. In a war zone, recognizing stress, exhaustion, and breaking points wasn't just helpful. It was literally a matter of life and death. The skills transferred more easily than expected. The same hypervigilance that had kept him alive during mortar attacks now helped him spot trouble before it became critical. Tonight, all his instincts warned that Dr. Martinez was approaching a dangerous threshold. "Frank," called Nurse Janet from behind the desk. Janet had been at St. Mary's for 15 years and was one of the few people who treated Frank as more than just a uniform. "Can you help move the patient in Bay 3? We need to get him to radiology." As he approached the trauma bay, Frank could hear the controlled urgency he recognized from field hospitals. Through the curtain, he saw Dr. Martinez reviewing X-rays, her face pale under the harsh lighting. 3 fractured ribs, possible internal bleeding, she was saying to Dr. Williams. "We need surgery within 30 minutes. Frank noticed her leaning heavily against the wall, and there was a tremor in her hands. He'd seen this presentation before, the moment when exhaustion pushed someone beyond their limits. Frank was preparing to help transport the patient when Dr. Martinez suddenly swayed on her feet. Her eyes rolled back, and she collapsed to the floor with a sickening thud. "Doctor down!" someone shouted. "We need help in Bay 3!" Panic erupted as nurses rushed toward the unconscious physician. The remaining doctors were already overwhelmed, and now their colleague needed immediate attention. Frank pushed through the curtain and dropped to his knees beside Dr. Martinez. His muscle memory from hundreds of battlefield medical emergencies took over. His fingers immediately found her pulse, strong but rapid. Her breathing was shallow but steady. He checked her pupils with a penlight from his belt, assessed for injury from the fall. "Get me an IV set-up blood pressure cuff and check her blood glucose," Frank said calmly, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from years of battlefield medicine. "She's presenting with hypoglycemic collapse, 14-hour shift, probably hasn't eaten since yesterday." "Frank, you can't," Nurse Janet started to protest. "Trust me," Frank interrupted, continuing his systematic assessment. "Start a dextrose IV, 25 grams, and normal saline for fluid replacement. Her blood pressure is dropping." Dr. Williams pushed through the crowd that had gathered around the trauma bay. "Sir, you need to step back. We'll take care of Dr. Martinez." Frank looked up at the younger doctor and recognized something he'd seen in new medics arriving in Afghanistan. Clinical knowledge but limited experience with high-stress situations where quick thinking meant the difference between life and death. "Her blood pressure is dropping and she's showing early signs of shock," Frank said, his voice remaining calm and authoritative. "We need large-bore IV access with normal saline and 25 grams of dextrose for the hypoglycemia." Dr. Williams stared at Frank in confusion. "How do you know all this? How are you making these assessments?" The medical team hesitated, caught between following protocols and recognizing that the man giving orders clearly knew what he was talking about. Frank could see the internal struggle on their faces. Without breaking eye contact with Dr. Williams, Frank slowly rolled up his left sleeve. The tattoo on his forearm was simple and military precise, a Purple Heart medal with 68W underneath, followed by 10th Mountain Division and Afghanistan 2009 to 2012. 68 West, Combat Medic Specialist. The Purple Heart meant he'd been wounded while treating others under enemy fire. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Dr. Williams' expression changed from confusion to understanding to deep respect. Nurse Janet immediately began preparing the IV equipment Frank had requested. "Was a combat medic," Frank corrected, still monitoring Dr. Martinez's pulse. "Staff Sergeant Frank Rodriguez, 10th Mountain Division, 3 tours in Afghanistan, attached to forward operating bases in Kandahar and Helmand provinces." As the medical team began treating Dr. Martinez following Frank's assessment, the atmosphere in the trauma bay shifted. The panic was replaced by focused, professional action. Frank stepped back slightly, allowing the hospital's medical team to take over, but remained close enough to monitor the situation. For the first time in 8 years, Frank felt the familiar weight of being truly seen. Not as a security guard who happened to know some first aid, but as the combat medic he'd once been, someone who'd saved lives under the worst possible conditions. Nurse Janet approached him quietly. "Frank, in 8 years of working together, why didn't you ever tell us about your medical background?" Frank watched as Dr. Martinez began responding to the IV fluids and dextrose. Her color was improving, her breathing becoming deeper and more regular. "Because I'm not a medic anymore," he said finally. "I'm security. That's my job here, and that's what matters." "But you could be doing so much more," Dr. Williams interjected. "With your experience and training, you could be working as a paramedic, going back to school for nursing." "My experience taught me that sometimes the best way to serve is quietly," Frank interrupted gently. "In the background, making sure everyone else can do their job safely and effectively." The words carried weight that went beyond their simple meaning. Frank had learned hard lessons about service and sacrifice during his years in Afghanistan, lessons that had shaped his understanding of what it meant to truly help others. Dr. Martinez stirred, her eyes fluttering open. Frank knelt beside her, his voice gentle. "Hey, Doc, you gave us a scare. How are you feeling?" "Embarrassed?" she whispered, trying to sit up. Frank kept her still with a gentle hand. "Easy. You collapsed from exhaustion. When's the last time you ate?" She thought for a moment. "Yesterday morning, I think." Frank shook his head. "Classic mistake. I've seen it hundreds of times. You can't save anyone if you don't save yourself first." As Dr. Martinez was helped to a wheelchair, she looked at Frank with new eyes. "You were really a combat medic?" Frank nodded. 68 whiskey, 3 tours, mostly trauma medicine. "The Purple Heart?" Frank's expression grew distant, and for a moment the busy hospital around them seemed to fade away. "IED blast outside Forward Operating Base Lightning, Kandahar Province, September 2011. I was treating 3 wounded soldiers from a convoy attack when a secondary device detonated about 30 meters from our position." He paused, unconsciously touching his left leg, where the old injury still caused him pain during long shifts. "The blast knocked me unconscious and embedded shrapnel in my leg and lower back. When I came to, one of the soldiers I'd been treating was bleeding out from a severed femoral artery. I managed to clamp the artery and get tourniquets on all 3 casualties before the medevac helicopter arrived. Spent the next 6 months in hospitals myself, but all 3 of those soldiers made it home to their families." The trauma bay had grown quiet as Frank spoke. Even the ambient noise of the emergency department seemed muted, as if the weight of his words had created a pocket of reverence in the midst of controlled chaos. Dr. Williams broke the silence. "That's incredible. The pressure you must have faced." Frank shrugged. "It was the job. When someone's life is in your hands, you do whatever it takes. The circumstances don't matter." As the immediate crisis passed, Frank resumed his security rounds. But something had changed. The medical staff looked at him differently now, spoke to him with new respect. For 8 years, he'd been essentially invisible in this hospital. A friendly face in a security uniform, someone who helped with occasional tasks and maintained a reassuring presence during the night shift. Now, suddenly, he was seen as something else entirely, a trained medical professional with combat experience and a service record that commanded respect. It was a feeling that made Frank both proud and uncomfortable. During his years in Afghanistan, he'd learned that respect earned through military service could be both a blessing and a burden. People expected things from veterans, heroism, leadership, wisdom, that didn't always align with reality. When Frank had been medically discharged from the Army, he'd struggled with his identity in ways that had nothing to do with his physical injuries. For years, his value and purpose had been defined by his ability to save lives under the most extreme conditions imaginable. Suddenly finding himself in the civilian world, where those skills weren't needed in the same way, had been more difficult than any physical rehabilitation. Working as hospital security had given him a way to serve others without the weight of expectations that came with being identified as a veteran or medical professional. He could help people, contribute to something meaningful, and maintain the sense of purpose that had defined his military service, all while remaining essentially anonymous. Now that anonymity was gone. Dr. Williams approached him later. "Frank, would you consider consulting with our emergency department? Training programs for stress management, trauma protocols?" For the first time in years, Frank considered expanding his role. What would that look like? Monthly training sessions, share battlefield techniques applicable to civilian care, help us understand performance under pressure. Frank thought carefully. And I'd still maintain security? Absolutely. This would be additional, not instead of. As his shift ended, Dr. Martinez stopped him. "Frank, I want you to have this." She handed him her card. "If you ever want to use your medical skills more formally, I know people who'd be honored to work with you." Frank pocketed the card. "Thank you, Doc." "Can I ask why security?" "With your training, you could have pursued healthcare careers." Frank was quiet for a long moment, considering how to explain something he'd never fully articulated, even to himself. "When I left the Army," he said finally, "I was angry. Not at the military, not at the war, but at everything. I'd spent years saving lives, and it felt like it hadn't mattered. People kept dying, the fighting kept going. Nothing I did seemed to make a lasting difference." He paused, watching the steady flow of medical professionals beginning their morning shifts. "Working security here gave me something I needed, a way to help people without the weight of life or death responsibility. I could contribute, I could serve, but I didn't have to carry the burden of being someone's last hope. I didn't have to watch good people die despite everything I did to save them." Dr. Martinez nodded slowly, understanding flickering in her eyes. "And now?" Frank smiled. "Now I'm thinking maybe I'm ready to carry some of that weight again. As a teacher, maybe. Someone who can help others be better at saving lives." 3 months later, Frank Rodriguez still worked the night security shift at St. Mary's Hospital. But twice a week, he also conducted specialized training sessions for the emergency medicine staff. He taught them breathing techniques that had kept him calm under mortar fire. He showed them triage protocols developed for battlefield medicine that proved invaluable in civilian mass casualty situations. He shared lessons learned from treating wounded soldiers in conditions where the nearest hospital was a helicopter ride away, and supplies were always limited. The hospital's trauma response times improved by 28% over the following quarter. Patient survival rates in critical cases increased significantly. Staff confidence during emergency situations rose dramatically, and turnover in the emergency department dropped to the lowest levels in the hospital's history. More importantly to Frank, he began to see the same sense of purpose and mission among the medical staff that he'd experienced during his military service. The doctors and nurses weren't just doing jobs anymore, they were part of something larger, something that mattered in ways that extended beyond individual cases or single shifts. Dr. Martinez often worked late just to catch Frank during his rounds. They would talk about medicine, about war, about the different ways people serve their communities and find meaning in their work. "You know what I learned from you, Frank?" she said one evening as they stood in the quiet hallway outside the emergency department. "What's that?" "That there are heroes all around us, doing important work that nobody sees or recognizes. We just have to take the time to notice them." Frank adjusted his radio and smiled. "Doc, the heroes are the ones saving lives every day. I just make sure they can do their jobs safely." As he walked away, Dr. Martinez shook her head. Some people were heroes precisely because they didn't think of themselves that way. Frank Rodriguez had earned his Purple Heart under enemy fire in Afghanistan. But every night at St. Mary's, he earned something more valuable, the quiet satisfaction of service that continues long after the war's end. Because the best heroes never stop serving, even when no one knows their story. Frank Rodriguez, combat medic, Purple Heart recipient, hospital security guard, teacher, silent guardian.